Hello, I'm Davina of sheepandstitch.com, and this is our first Geek Out Knitting Explainer video, where I talk about extremely technical, super geeky, nerdy knitting questions. Alright, so this week's question actually comes from a commenter, and she asks, when you're doing the longtail cast on, why do you have to keep the longtail up front and the yarn with your ball in the back? And that's a great question. When I first started knitting, I asked that same question to a very sweet auntie who taught me how to knit, and her answer was, it's just the way it's done. Everybody does it, so yeah. Now that was not very satisfying for me, so when Google came around, I started Googling and I discovered a great site called techknitting.blogspot.com, and I learned the secret to this question. And I'm going to link to it right here. Hat tip to techknitting.blogspot.com. That site is just a wealth of knitting nerdery. I love it. Okay, so the reason why you want to keep your longtail up front when you're doing the longtail cast on is, it really has to do with scarcity. You don't have a lot of longtail, right? You kind of have to eyeball how much longtail that you have. And the yarn in the back, or the other side of your yarn, is the yarn that's attached to your ball. And you've got a lot of this yarn, right? You don't have to really worry about this yarn running out before you finish casting on. But you certainly have to worry about your yarn tail, not having enough of it before you finish your cast on. So that's really the reason why you want your long tail in the front. And I'm going to walk you through why this is. All right, so let's cast on a few stitches with the long tail, and we'll look at the structure of the long tail cast on, and I'll, explain what I mean when I talk about scarcity and all that kind of stuff. Alrighty, so I've got a couple stitches on here, and let's do one more. Okay, cool. So when you look at the long tail cast on, you can see that it's actually made up of two sets of loops. You've got the loops down here, which make up the edge of our cast on, and that gives us a nice, sturdy edge. That's why the longtail cast on is awesome for picking up stitches, and for edges that need to be sturdy, like, the collar of a turtleneck, for instance. So this is the edge of our cast on stitch, and this is made up of a series of loops. Now we've also got some loops at the top. These loops right here, they look just like, stitches. They're the stitches that we knit into, these loops. So when we're making the longtail cast on, one side of our yarn makes the loops down here, this little edge, and one side of our yarn makes the loops that sit on our needle, these stitches. So I wonder which the longtail is in charge of. Alright, so if you guessed the edge of our cast on, you would be right. So let's take a closer look at how, the longtail cast on actually comes together. So I've got my two fingers, clamping down, opening up these two yarn threads, and I'm going to move my hand to the back, and I'm going to pick up this loop right here. Now this is our long tail, right? This is our long tail, and I just picked up a loop through the long tail. So watch this long tail and see what it actually becomes when we've finished making this cast on. Now this yarn is the yarn attached to our ball. So we're going to bring it over our needle, and you can see that the yarn attached to our ball is over our needle right now. And then I'm going to bring this long tail loop over my needle, and I'm going to pull down. Now as I pull down, you can see this is my long tail, and what's actually happening to that loop, to my long tail loop. I'm pulling it down, and it has become this little loop that sits on the edge of our, the bottom row of our cast on edge, right? It's right here. And the yarn in the back has become this loop. So I'll do that again just so you can see it a little bit better, okay? So this is my long tail, and I'm just going to cast on with it. First loop, here it is. This is the yarn attached to my ball, and I'm going to bring that over so you can see that this is already sitting over my needle, right? Now I'm going to bring my long tail over this loop, and now you can see that, the yarn attached to my ball is definitely sitting on my needle, and my long tail, here's my long tail, I'm pulling it, and there we go. It has become the loop down here that secures, the loop on my needle. Okay, so what does this have to do with keeping your yarn tail in the front? Alright, so if you look at these loops that we've got here, you can see that the loops that sit on my needle are much larger than the loops that make up the cast on edge. So because we have less yarn on our long tail, we want to conserve that yarn. We don't want to go blowing it on big loops on our needle. We want to make tiny, small loops, right? The loops down here, right? So that we can conserve the long tail, because there's nothing worse than getting to the end of your cast on or getting to the end of your long tail and realizing that you don't have enough long tail to finish your cast on. That really blows, because you've got to rip everything out and start again, right? So it just makes sense to use the larger supply of yarn, which is the yarn attached to our ball of yarn, to be making these big loops, right? And using our long tail, which we have a very little amount of, to be making the smaller loops. So that's what I mean when I say that it has to do with scarcity. All right, so I hope that answers your question to the wonderful commenter who asked, why do you have to keep the long tail up front and, the yarn attached to your ball in the back? Now, if you enjoyed this video, then please like it and subscribe right here for more knitting and pattern tutorials. Okay, that's it for me. I'm Davina of sheepandstitch.com, and I'll catch you next time with another knitting video.